The session record of the Interstellar Governance Council, Cycle 4891, Standard Galactic Reckoning, would later become the most studied political document in the known galaxy. Not because of its wisdom. Because of its catastrophic miscalculation. 43 species. 1 vote. The chamber of the IGC was carved into the orbital station above the gas giant Varith 9, a structure so old that 3 of the species present had not yet achieved spaceflight when it was first assembled. It hummed with the low vibration of translation arrays converting 57 distinct biological languages into something each delegate could absorb without confusion. The air was a careful blend, oxygen-nitrogen for the oxygen breathers, trace methane pockets near the Drevithi delegation, and the soft hiss of pressurized argon around the crystalline Solon who communicated through resonance rather than speech. It was, by every measurable standard, an impressive civilization. And it had just finished dismissing humanity from the council floor. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the speaking platform for 4 minutes and 12 seconds before the chamber's translation array clicked off, the IGC's formal signal that a speaker's time had been terminated. Not expired. Terminated. It was a distinction that carried weight. Time expiration was neutral. Termination was deliberate. She did not move immediately. The counselors shifted in their varied forms of seated posture. The Kethara delegate, a 6-limbed species whose evolutionary history had produced what amounted to a biological polygraph, registered her biochemical response. Elevated cortisol, steady heart rate, no spike in the threat markers that typically preceded an emotional outburst. The report would later note that Ambassador Vasquez displayed controlled containment indicative of disciplined military or diplomatic training. What she actually felt, she would write in her memoir published 11 years later, was something close to relief. Because she had expected this. The motion before the council that day was formally titled Resolution 1847C, Reclassification of the Terran Confederacy from Provisional Observer Status to Non-Participant Standing. In plain language, it meant humanity was being removed from the table. The stated reasons filled 32 translated pages. Humanity had been a provisional observer for 19 years. In that time, Earth's representatives had raised objections to 11 separate IGC resolutions, more than any other single species in the history of the body. They had questioned the enforcement methodology of the Drevithi-led patrol fleet during the Kellen Corridor incident. They had submitted a 400-page counter-analysis challenging the Council's economic modeling for the RIM trade agreements. They had, most controversially, formally accused the Solon Consensus of manipulating translation data during the Yared arbitration. The last accusation had been proven correct 18 months later, by an independent review. The Council had quietly amended the record and moved on without acknowledging the correction. Humanity had not moved on. The Terran delegation, said Arch-Counselor Mevith of the Kethara, his translation rendered in a deep, measured baritone by the array, has demonstrated a consistent pattern of procedural disruption, unilateral assertion, and a fundamental incompatibility with collective governance norms. The Council exists to maintain stability across 43 sovereign systems. It cannot function if its processes are perpetually challenged by a species with a measured pause, a mere 2 centuries of spaceflight and 1 inhabited system. The chamber registered something that translated, imperfectly, as polite laughter. Elena Vasquez watched the vote counter on the display above the chamber floor. The tally moved with the methodical certainty of something that had already been decided before anyone arrived. 39 in favor. 2 opposed. 2 abstained. Humanity was out. What the Council did not know, what no external intelligence service in the galaxy had yet fully assembled, was what humanity had been doing for the past 11 years while attending these sessions as a provisional observer. They had been learning. Not languages, though they had learned those too. Not customs, though they had catalogued every one. They had been learning the architecture of the Council's power, the dependencies, the supply chains, the patrol routes, the treaty obligations that function less as principles and more as pressure points. They had been studying which alliances were genuine and which were transactional. They had mapped the 11 contested corridor systems where IGC jurisdiction was theoretically absolute but practically hollow. They had spent 4 years quietly building relationships with 3 smaller species, the Helari, the Mundri, and the Cath, who had their own grievances with the Council's dominant bloc but lacked the leverage to act on them. None of this was illegal under the IGC Charter. Humanity had simply read the Charter more carefully than the species that had written it. The Terran Confederacy Strategic Liaison Office operated out of a building on Earth's western coast, unremarkable from the outside, with a staff of roughly 400 analysts. Director Kofi Asante received the vote confirmation at 0347 local time. He read the tally, set down his coffee, and authorized the release of a pre-prepared document to 41 independent communication relays positioned throughout the outer IGC systems. The document was not a protest. It was not an ultimatum. It was a detailed, sourced, and extensively footnoted report on the Solon Consensus's pattern of translation manipulation spanning 40 years of IGC proceedings, including 16 instances that had directly altered territorial and trade decisions affecting the Helari, Mundri, and Cath. It was addressed not to the IGC. It was addressed to those three species directly. Ambassador Vasquez left the chamber with the same measured pace she had entered. Her aide, a young man named Tariq who had been with the delegation for 3 years and had never quite learned to mask his emotions as completely as she had, fell into step beside her in the corridor. "That's it then," he said quietly. "That's the beginning," she said. He thought about that for a moment. "What do we do now?" She glanced back once at the chamber doors, the great carved panels depicting 43 species in a composition that had been designed, notably, before humanity had been considered for membership, and had never been updated to include them. "Now," she said, "we stop asking permission." In the outer systems, the document had already begun to transmit. In 48 hours, the Helari Republic would request an emergency session. In 6 days, the Mundri Compact would suspend its trade cooperation agreement with the Solon Consensus pending independent review. In 11 days, the Cath Assembly would do something that had not happened in 230 years of IGC history. They would invoke the Charter's Article 7, the collective grievance mechanism that the Council's dominant species had written into the founding documents as a theoretical safeguard, never seriously expecting it to be used. The vote to dismiss humanity had passed 39-2. The consequences would require a much larger chamber to contain. There is a concept in Terran strategic doctrine that predates spaceflight by several centuries. It was articulated in different forms by military theorists, diplomats, and game theorists across Earth's history, but its core principle remained consistent. The most dangerous position is not one of obvious strength. It is one of underestimated capability combined with clear motivation. The Terran Confederacy had spent 19 years as a provisional observer in the IGC. 11 of those years, beginning precisely when the Internal Strategic Liaison Office completed its first comprehensive threat assessment of the Council's political structure, had been spent in deliberate preparation for the scenario that had just occurred. Director Kofi Asante had joined the Strategic Liaison Office at 34, after 12 years in the Terran Diplomatic Corps and before that a doctorate in comparative political systems from Nairobi University. He was not a soldier. He had never commanded a fleet or directed a military operation. What he understood, at a level that few people in any institution on Earth matched, was how power structures failed. Not how they were defeated. How they failed themselves. Every large institution, he had written in his first major internal assessment, distributed to the Council of Ministers in the year humanity entered its 8th year of observer status, accumulates what I will call procedural momentum. It develops habits of decision-making that become indistinguishable, to its members, from principles. The longer the institution has operated without serious challenge, the more completely it mistakes its habits for truths. The IGC has operated for over 2,000 years. It does not believe it has habits. It believes it has wisdom. That distinction is the most exploitable vulnerability we have identified. The assessment had been classified at the highest level. Its recommendations had been approved quietly, funded through a budget line that appeared in Confederacy records as extended diplomatic infrastructure, and implemented over the following decade with the patient precision of a project that understood it would not produce results for years. The first element was data. Humanity's analytical teams had spent years processing every available piece of IGC documentation. Session records, translated proceedings, trade data, patrol reports, publicly filed grievances, and building models of the Council's actual decision-making patterns versus its stated ones. The gap between those two things was, as Asante's team had predicted, significant. The IGC presented itself as a collective governance body of equals. In practice, 5 species, the Kethra, the Solon Consensus, the Drevithi Hegemony, the Verity Union, and the Pale Reach Confederation, controlled approximately 83% of all meaningful outcomes. The remaining 38 species functioned as a legitimizing audience, their votes occasionally relevant in cases where the dominant 5 were split, but structurally peripheral. This was not a secret exactly. Most political analysts with access to IGC records could have inferred it. What Humanity's team had done was quantify it in a way that made it actionable. mapping precisely which decisions had been driven by which combinations of dominant species interest, identifying the specific treaty obligations and resource dependencies that kept the peripheral species aligned with their bloc, and calculating the threshold at which those peripheral relationships could be disrupted. The three species that Vasquez's team had quietly cultivated, the Helari, the Mundri, and the Cath, had not been chosen randomly. They had been selected through a scoring model that evaluated four factors: the size of their legitimate grievances against the dominant bloc, the degree to which those grievances were documented and therefore verifiable, the strategic position of their territorial holdings within IGC space, and their existing relationship with each other. The Helari were a mid-tier species with a documented claim to 3 disputed corridor systems that the Solon Consensus had absorbed during a contested arbitration 30 years prior. The arbitration had been resolved through a translation process that had since been shown, quietly in an IGC internal review that had never been made public, to contain errors that favored the Solon position. The Mundri Compact operated the most significant independent trade relay network in the outer IGC systems. They were not militarily powerful, but their infrastructure was load-bearing in a way that the dominant species had never fully appreciated because they had never needed to. The Cath Assembly were, by galactic standards, unremarkable. Small population, limited military capacity, single inhabited system. What they possessed that no other species in the peripheral bloc had was a seat on the IGC's Constitutional Oversight Committee, a body so rarely invoked that most current council members had never seen it activated. They held that seat because of a 200-year-old treaty that the dominant species had since forgotten the terms of. Humanity's archival team had not forgotten. The second element was positioning. While the diplomatic preparation proceeded, the Terran Confederacy had been quietly and legally restructuring its military posture in the outer systems. This was not a secret arms buildup, it was more subtle and, in some ways, more significant. It was a change in doctrine. For the first decade of its IGC membership, humanity had maintained what its military called a consolidated defense posture. Forces concentrated near Earth and the 6 inhabited systems of the inner Terran sphere. This made sense as a posture for a species new to interstellar politics, protecting its core while it learned the landscape. Over the following 11 years, that posture had shifted. Not dramatically, the overall force size had grown modestly, in line with Confederacy economic expansion. But the distribution had changed fundamentally. Terran assets were now positioned across a network of 17 logistical nodes extending through the outer systems, many of them in locations that, on a strategic map, would appear to be forward deployed. They were not forward deployed in the aggressive sense. They were positioned for extended operations in disputed or under-patrolled space. The distinction mattered. The IGC's patrol fleet, dominated by Drevithi and Kethare assets, was an impressive structure when viewed at a glance. It covered 31 patrol corridors, maintained presence at all major transit points, and had not faced a serious challenge in over a century. What humanities analysts had identified, after years of studying patrol schedules, logistical contracts, and maintenance records, was that the fleet's coverage was optimized for the threats of 2 centuries ago. It was deep in certain well-traveled corridors and thin, sometimes vanishingly thin, in the outer regions where the Helari's contested systems sat, where the Mundri's relay network ran, where the Cath Assembly's single system occupied a position of quiet but genuine strategic value. Nobody in the council had needed to think about those gaps because nobody with the capability to exploit them had ever had a reason to. The document that Asante released on the night of the vote was the third element, and it was precisely as explosive as it had been designed to be. 40 years of Solon translation manipulation was not a small allegation. It was a structural accusation, the kind that, if verified, called into question not just the Solon Consensus but the validity of dozens of decisions that had been made on the basis of those translated proceedings. Territorial allocations, resource agreements, patrol jurisdiction boundaries. The Helari's lost corridor systems. It had been verified. Humanity's team had spent 3 years assembling the verification, cross-referencing original communication records obtained through legal observer status access with the official translated versions, documenting the discrepancies with the kind of meticulous precision that left no reasonable interpretive escape. They had waited for this moment to release it. Not out of spite. Out of timing. Released while humanity sat at the council table, the document would have been managed, buried in a procedural response, challenged on jurisdictional grounds, diluted by the council's institutional reflexes. Released the same night humanity was removed from the table, it went directly to the 3 species most directly harmed by the manipulations, and it went through independent relays that the IGC had no authority to block. By morning, the Helari Republic's Council of Ministers had confirmed receipt and begun its own verification process. By the following afternoon, the Mundry Compact's Trade Directorate had placed its cooperation agreement with the Solon Consensus under review. The Cath Assembly, quiet, small, strategically placed, holding their ancient seat on the Constitutional Oversight Committee, had called an emergency session of their own government. In the IGC chamber above Varith 9, the Arch-Chancellor of the Cathare had received a briefing that began with the words, "unexpected development," and ended with a recommended immediate response to prevent procedural escalation. He had not yet replied. He was, for the first time in his tenure, uncertain what to say. Vasquez received Asante's confirmation message on the shuttle back to the Terran diplomatic vessel. It was 4 words. Phase 1. As planned. She looked out at the stars for a long moment, at the vast, indifferent dark and the small bright points that represented 43 civilizations, most of them significantly older and more powerful than her own, all of them in the process of discovering that the species they had just dismissed had spent a decade learning exactly which questions to ask, exactly where the load-bearing walls were, and exactly how to begin removing them, not with force but with something the IGC had never quite learned to defend against. The truth delivered at the right time to the right people in the right order. Article 7 of the Interstellar Governance Council's founding charter had been written 2,247 years ago by a committee of 9 species who had just survived the only interstellar conflict the founding members had ever experienced. A resource war that had burned through 4 systems and left 2 species permanently reduced in population and capacity. The drafters had been genuinely idealistic. They had also been, by the evidence of the document they produced, genuinely afraid of what concentrated power could do when it moved without accountability. Article 7 was their answer to that fear. It was titled Collective Grievance and Constitutional Review, and it established a process by which any 3 or more member species who shared a documented grievance against a member or group of members, including the Council's own governance structures, could invoke a formal constitutional review that superseded the normal session agenda and required response within 30 standard days. The mechanism had 2 features that made it extraordinary. First, it could not be tabled, procedurally delayed, or voted down by the accused parties. They were explicitly recused from procedural votes during a collective grievance review. Second, the Constitutional Oversight Committee that managed the process held its authority from the original founding charter, not from the Council's operating rules, meaning that the committee's procedural decisions could not be overridden by a Council majority. In 2,247 years, Article 7 had been invoked exactly twice. Both times in the first century of the IGC's existence, before the dominant species had fully consolidated their positions. Both times, it had been resolved through negotiated settlement before reaching constitutional adjudication. The reason it had never been invoked again was simple. Invoking it required courage that smaller species rarely possessed, because the dominant bloc's informal response to such challenges had always been, historically, economic and political pressure sufficient to discourage the attempt. The Helari, the Mundry, and the Cath had now invoked it. And the reason they had been willing to do so, the reason they had accepted the risk that would normally have deterred them, was that they had not done so alone. The Terran Confederacy could not formally co-invoke Article 7. It had just been reclassified as a non-participant, removing it from the member roster. This was, almost certainly, a detail that the Council's dominant bloc had considered a clean administrative outcome when they arranged the vote. What they had not considered was that non-participant status carried no restriction on diplomatic engagement with member species. Humanity was outside the Council, but it was not isolated from it. And the 3 species who had invoked Article 7 had done so with the full support, logistical, analytical, and in the case of the Mundry's relay network, infrastructural, of the Terran Confederacy. The Helari's formal grievance filing ran to 847 pages. It had been drafted over 18 months, with research support from Asante's office, legal review from a team of Terran constitutional scholars who had spent 4 years specializing in IGC charter law, and verification from the same archival analysis that had documented the Solon translation manipulations. It was, by every technical measure, the most thoroughly documented grievance submission in the IGC's history. The Mundry's filing focused specifically on the economic consequences of the translation manipulations, the trade agreements that had been negotiated on falsified foundations, the resource allocation decisions that had routed value away from outer system species based on proceedings that were now under serious question. Their economists had calculated a conservative estimate of 340 years of cumulative economic disadvantage attributable to the documented discrepancies. The CAF filing was the shortest, 7 pages. It identified their seat on the Constitutional Oversight Committee, formally notified the Council that they were activating that seat, named the 2 outer system species they were asking to join the committee for this review, and cited the specific articles under which the review would proceed. The IGC's administrative office received all 3 filings within a 6-hour window. The receipt of the third triggered an automated notification to the Arch-Counselor's office and all senior council members. The message was flagged as Constitutional Process Initiated. Article 7 Active. Mandatory response window, 30 standard days. Arch-Counselor Mevith of the KETHRA had been in his position for 19 years, which meant he had overseen the entirety of humanity's observer period. He was not, by any measure, an unintelligent being. His species' evolutionary history had produced exceptional pattern recognition capability, and he had risen through the Council's political structure through genuine acumen rather than mere seniority. He looked at the Article 7 notification for a long time before summoning his senior staff. The meeting that followed lasted 4 hours. It was, according to the aide who would later provide a detailed account to a HLRI journalist, unlike any session Mevith had conducted before. Usually his briefings were structured, forward-moving, focused on decisions. This one circled. Because the problem was not procedural. It was architectural. Article 7 invoked, with 3 valid member species, was self-executing. The Constitutional Oversight Committee was now active. The review process was now running. The dominant block's standard responses, economic pressure, procedural delay, quiet diplomatic persuasion, were recused. They could engage in the review process, they could not manage it. The question was what the review would find. And the answer to that question, the Solon Consensus's own internal analysts confirmed it within 12 hours of the filings, was not comfortable. The translation manipulation was documented. The evidence was organized with a precision that had clearly not been assembled in haste. Whatever the Terran Diplomatic Archive had spent the past several years doing, it had produced a body of evidence that, subjected to independent verification, would almost certainly hold. The Solon Consensus's senior representative, a species that communicated through resonance and whose emotional states were therefore audible rather than visible, sat through a briefing in which the word indefensible was used twice by their own legal review team. The resonance in the chamber took on frequencies that the translation array rendered, to the KETHRA aide in the corner, as something close to dread. What made the situation genuinely unprecedented was not the legal exposure. Institutions manage legal exposure. What made it unprecedented was the combination of legal exposure, structural political challenge, and the presence of the Terran Confederacy operating as a non-participant entity with evident capability and clear motivation. Because humanity had not stopped with the document. On the day after the vote, the Terran Confederacy had made 2 additional moves that the Council's intelligence services were still processing. The first was the announcement of a Outer Systems Infrastructure Partnership, a bilateral framework offered simultaneously to the HLRI Republic, the Mundry Compact and the Cath Assembly. The partnership offered Terran logistical support, technical assistance and communication relay access in exchange for formalized cooperation agreements. It was entirely within the legal rights of a non-participant entity. It was also, in strategic terms, the beginning of an alternative institutional structure operating in the spaces the IGC's dominant bloc had always treated as their periphery. The second was more subtle. 7 smaller species who had never received particular attention from the Terran delegation before, species with varied grievances, limited power, and a consistent history of voting with the dominant bloc because they had no other realistic option, received, through diplomatic channels, a detailed briefing on Article 7, its history, its protections, and humanity's offer to provide the same quality of legal and analytical support to any species considering its use. It was not a recruitment drive. It was information. Freely given. Accurately presented. The decision to act on it was entirely those species' own. Within 72 hours, 2 of those 7 species had requested further meetings. Vasquez gave one formal public statement from the Terran diplomatic vessel in the 48 hours following the vote. It was brief, 14 sentences, and deliberately unremarkable in tone. It thanked the Council for the years of provisional observer access, acknowledged the decision, and noted that the Terran Confederacy looked forward to continued positive relationships with all IGC member species in whatever capacity was appropriate. It said nothing about Article 7. Nothing about the document. Nothing about the partnership announcement. The statement was almost aggressively moderate. Several IGC Council members, reading it, registered relief. One described it internally as the graceful exit of a species that has understood its limitations. The Kethare aide who had been in the Solon briefing, who had heard the frequencies of dread, sent a private message to a contact in the Helari diplomatic corps that evening. It was not an official communication. It was not authorized. It read, they knew exactly what they were doing. They knew before the vote was called. The contact in the Helari diplomatic corps did not reply immediately. She was in a meeting with a Terran diplomatic attaché named Tariq, who had apparently entirely overcome his inability to mask his emotions and was instead channeling them into something that looked, to every observer in the room, like quiet, methodical competence. He was walking the Helari team through the Constitutional Oversight Committee procedures, page by page, in case they needed any clarification. They had come prepared with questions. He had answers for all of them. The IGC's dominant bloc had a word, or rather, the Kethare's language had a concept that the translation array rendered imperfectly as strategic patience. It described a quality that the Council's elder species attributed to themselves as a mark of civilizational maturity: the ability to wait, to move slowly, to allow time to work in your favor rather than forcing outcomes through urgency. They had not, until this moment, considered that a species with 2 centuries of spaceflight might understand patience better than they did. The Terran Confederacy's approach to the post-dismissal period had been planned in 3 phases. Phase 1, the document release, the Article 7 filings, the partnership announcement, was complete. It had performed within the projected parameters. The reaction in the Council was exactly what the models had predicted: confusion followed by compartmentalization, with the dominant species attempting to manage each element of the response separately rather than recognizing them as a coordinated whole. Phase 2 was what Asante's office called, in the dry language of internal planning documents, consolidation and demonstration. It was designed to last between 90 and 120 standard days. Its objective was not to win. Winning would come later, and it would come from conditions that Phase 2 was designed to create. Phase 2's objective was to establish, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the Terran Confederacy's exit from the Council table had not reduced its relevance. If anything, it had increased it. This was a counterintuitive proposition. It required demonstration, not assertion. The demonstration began on day 4. The Mundry Compact's relay network was the most consequential piece of infrastructure in the outer IGC systems that the dominant species had spent the least time thinking about. This was partly because the Mundry themselves were unremarkable by the metrics the Council used to evaluate species significance: military capacity, territorial holdings, population size. They ranked low on all 3. What they had built, over 3 centuries of careful engineering, was a communication relay network that handled 61% of all non-military data transmission in the systems beyond the rim belt. Most of the IGC's member species used it. Many of them used it for critical functions: commercial coordination, scientific exchange, diplomatic backchannels. The 5 dominant species used it for things their own networks didn't cover efficiently in the outer systems, which they would have acknowledged if pressed, but had never been pressed to quantify. The Mundry had, as part of their Article 7 filing, suspended their cooperation agreement with the Solon Consensus. This was a legal, proportionate response to documented grievance. Its practical effect was a 12% reduction in available relay capacity for Solon-connected traffic in the outer systems. 12% was manageable. Annoying but manageable. What was not manageable was what happened when the Terran Mundry Infrastructure Partnership, announced the day after the dismissal vote, began its first operational phase. The Confederacy provided 12 new relay nodes, prefabricated, pre-tested, ready for installation, to fill gaps in the Mundry network that the Mundry had been waiting 18 years to fill but had never had the capital to address. The nodes went live within 9 days. The Mundry network's capacity in the outer systems increased by 31%. The Solon Consensus's alternative routing options, which had seemed adequate before, were now, relative to the Mundry Terran network, measurably slower and more expensive. Several commercial entities in the outer systems who had been using Solon-adjacent relay services quietly began renegotiating their contracts. It was not a weapon. It was infrastructure. But infrastructure, placed correctly, changes the landscape that everyone else has to navigate. The Constitutional Oversight Committee convened for the first time in over 2 centuries in the small chamber that had been built for it at the IGC station's interior, a room that several current station staff had reportedly not known existed. The Cath Assembly's representative, A dignified elder named Savath, who communicated in a language that the array rendered as deliberate and spare, opened the session with a reading of the founding charter's relevant provisions. The process was archaic. It was also legally unassailable. The committee's first formal act was to request from the Solon Consensus a complete archive of all translation records for the 40-year period identified in the grievance filing. The request carried the force of the founding charter. Refusal would constitute a constitutional violation. The Solon Consensus complied within the required window. This was in itself notable. The assumption in some quarters had been that the dominant species would find a way to delay, challenge, or partially respond. They did not. The reason the Solon Consensus's legal team had determined was that partial compliance would be worse than full compliance. It would confirm the inference that they were concealing something, while full compliance at least preserved the theoretical possibility that the discrepancies could be explained as systematic error rather than deliberate manipulation. The committee received the archives and began its review. The Terran legal and analytical team that had spent years building the original evidence was made available to the committee. Not as advocates, they had no formal standing, but as technical consultants who could assist with the interpretation of translation methodology. The committee accepted this assistance. There was no rule against it. It was on day 17 that the situation shifted in a way that the dominant bloc had not modeled. The two smaller species who had requested further meetings with Terran diplomats in the days following the dismissal had, as expected, been exploring their own potential use of Article 7. This was known, monitored, and regarded by the dominant bloc as a manageable concern. Small species with limited grievances, easily deterred through private diplomatic channels. What the dominant bloc's intelligence services had not identified was a third, smaller species, the Yaret, whose name had come up in the original accusation about the Yaret arbitration that had been proven correct, who had been in contact with the Terran diplomatic team for 6 months prior to the vote, not about Article 7 but about something else entirely. The Yaret inhabited a system in a region of space that had been under a territorial designation dispute for nearly a century. The dispute was theoretical. Nobody actively contested Yaret's presence in their system, but the unresolved designation meant that they technically fell under the IGC's contested territorial classification, which limited their treaty rights in ways that had practical consequences for their commercial activities. The territorial designation had been under dispute because the Verity Union and the Kethra had a long-standing disagreement about whose historical claim took precedence in the surrounding sector. Neither cared enough about the Yaret system itself to resolve the dispute. They cared about the precedent that resolution might set for adjacent regions. The Yaret had been living with the consequences of other species' political inertia for a century. The Terran diplomatic team had, 6 months prior, provided the Yaret with a legal analysis suggesting that under a specific clause of the IGC's territorial framework, one that had been written to resolve exactly this type of multi-party historical claim dispute, the Yaret could file for unilateral designation if the dispute remained unresolved past a threshold period. The threshold period, calculated from the original filing date, passed on day 17 after the dismissal vote. The Yaret filed. It was legal. It was documented. It was supported by a brief that the Verity Union's own legal team, reviewing it within 12 hours, described internally as technically correct. The Verity Union and the Kethra were now in the position of either accepting the resolution, which set a precedent neither wanted, or contesting it, which would draw them into a legal process in the middle of the Article 7 review, dividing their political and legal resources. They contested it. Asante read the brief confirming the Verity Kethra contest decision from his office in the Western Coast building and added a single notation to the Phase 2 tracking document. As projected. Dominant Bloc Resource Division initiated. His deputy, a woman named Dr. Priya Nair, who had come from academic international relations theory and had spent 2 years adjusting to the reality that her theoretical models were being tested in actual interstellar politics, looked up from her own workstation. 3 fronts now, she said. Article 7, the network infrastructure, and Yaret. For, Asante said. He pulled up a separate document. The Cathas Constitutional Committee seat triggers an automatic review of all decisions made during the period covered by the grievance filing. That includes about 30 territorial allocations. Nair was quiet for a moment. How many of those involve the dominant species? All of them involve the dominant species, he said. That's the point. She thought about the council chamber vote that had started this. 39-2. The casual certainty of it. The translated laughter. They thought they were solving a problem, she said. They were, Asante agreed. They just solved it in the wrong direction. Outside the window, the Pacific moved in long, slow swells. The building's communications array was processing traffic from 17 outer system nodes, 3 active diplomatic channels, and the growing legal teams of 4 species who had, for various reasons and through entirely different paths, concluded that the Terran Confederacy's analytical and diplomatic resources were worth working with. None of them were the IGC's dominant species. All of them were, in their own ways, load-bearing. In the halls of the IGC station above Vareth 9, a Kethara intelligence analyst named Graveth compiled a report that his superiors would later describe as overcorrected and unnecessarily alarming before quietly classifying it and distributing it to exactly 6 people. The report was titled, Terran Strategic Behavior, Historical Context and Pattern Analysis. It was not a document about humanity's current diplomatic maneuvering. It was a document about where that maneuvering had come from. Graveth had spent 3 years working on the Terran desk before the dismissal vote, which meant he had access to more detailed information about humanity's history than most council members ever sought out. Most of what he'd read had seemed, in context, like the unremarkable background material of a moderately capable species trying to find its footing in interstellar politics. In the context of the past 22 days, it read very differently. His central argument was this: the Terran Confederacy was applying, at interstellar scale and with evident sophistication, a body of strategic, diplomatic and organizational knowledge that had been developed, tested, refined, and in some cases painfully learned through approximately 10,000 years of documented conflict, diplomacy, economic competition, and institutional evolution, all of it conducted among a single highly fractious species on a single planet. The IGC's dominant species had developed their strategic traditions through wars with other species, conflicts with fundamentally different opponents, requiring adaptation to genuinely alien behaviors. That was a formidable experience base. But it was also, Graveth argued, an experience base with a specific blind spot. Humanity had developed its strategic tradition by fighting itself. The implications of this distinction were not immediately obvious, but Graveth had taken care to make them concrete. Species who had learned strategy through interstellar conflict had learned to read alien behavior, to identify non-human patterns, to navigate radical difference. This was genuinely difficult and the skills involved were real. But interstellar conflicts, in the IGC's experience, had also tended toward resolution through either military dominance or territorial separation. The winning side established its position, the losing side accepted it or was eliminated, and the resulting order persisted until it was challenged by external force. Humanity had never had that option. On a single planet, separated factions could not achieve permanent resolution through elimination or territorial separation. Not for long, not without consequences that rebounded. Every war Earth had fought had produced aftermath. Every peace had required management. Every alliance had been formed among parties who remembered being enemies and would potentially be enemies again. The entire strategic tradition was built around the problem of competing parties who could not escape each other and therefore had to find ways to operate in the same space while pursuing incompatible objectives. This produced, Graveth noted, a specific set of capabilities that the IGC had no equivalent for because the IGC had never needed them. It produced expertise in multi-party negotiation, not bilateral, not sequential, but genuinely simultaneous multi-party dynamics where shifting alliances and cross-cutting interests had to be tracked and exploited in real time. It produced deep familiarity with institutional failure modes, the ways that governance bodies calcified, the mechanisms through which formal rules diverged from practical power, the pressure points at which ostensibly stable systems became brittle. It produced what Graveth described, in a phrase that his superiors found particularly uncomfortable, as an almost clinical understanding of how to dismantle structures from within while maintaining the appearance of working within them. He cited, as a specific example, the sequence of moves humanity had made since the dismissal vote. Article 7 was a feature of the IGC Charter. The relay network expansion was permissible under non-participant status. The Yaret territorial filing was legally correct. The outreach to peripheral species was informational, not coercive. Every element was within the rules. The combination was devastating. The Terran approach, Graveth wrote, does not resemble a challenge to the IGC. It resembles a process of demonstrating, through legal and institutional means, that the IGC's current structure is inconsistent with its founding principles, a process designed to produce, over time, either structural reform or structural legitimacy crisis. Both outcomes advantage the Terran position. He concluded with a line that he later said he had considered removing but ultimately included because he believed it was accurate. We may have dismissed a species that has been training for exactly this situation for longer than the IGC has existed. The report was classified. But Graveth was not the only person reaching similar conclusions. In the Helari Republic's capital, the senior legal team working on the Article 7 case had now been through 3 review cycles of the Solon translation archives with the Terran consultants. The discrepancies were not isolated incidents. They were systematic. The pattern was consistent across 4 decades. In translation sessions where Solon territorial or economic interests were directly implicated, the rendered translations showed a statistically significant bias in word choice, emphasis, and the handling of conditional or uncertain statements. Not fabrications. Adjustments. Subtle enough to survive casual review. Significant enough, across hundreds of decisions, to produce outcomes that differed from what a neutral translation would have produced. The Terran consultant on the team, a quiet woman named Dr. Yemi Adeyemi, who had a background in computational linguistics and had, it emerged, spent 6 years building the detection methodology specifically for this analysis, had developed a scoring system that quantified the degree of variance in each session. The highest scores corresponded, almost without exception, to sessions where the resulting IGC decision had gone against Helari, Mundri, or Cath interests. The legal team lead, a Helari jurist named Evreth who had practiced IGC charter law for 40 years and had, until 3 weeks ago, considered the current council structure essentially stable, reviewed the scoring data and sat quietly for a long time before speaking. "This is not a filing about the past 40 years, she said finally. Dr. Adeyemi looked up. "This is a filing about the institutional foundation of the IGC's decision-making authority," Evreth continued. "If translation fidelity cannot be guaranteed in contested proceedings, the validity of those proceedings is fundamentally compromised." "That's the argument," Dr. Adeyemi confirmed. "And your government has been building this case for how long?" A brief pause. "The analytical framework was established about 6 years ago. The evidence collection has been running for 3. Evreth was quiet again. Outside the window of the legal office, the Helari capital spread in its characteristic layered architecture. A species that built upward and inward, cities that resembled geological formations, ancient and structured. "You planned this from outside the council," she said. It was not quite an accusation. It was closer to recognition. "We identified what needed to be documented," Dr. Adeyemi said carefully. "What to do with it was always your decision. And if we had not invoked Article 7? There were other options under consideration." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. On day 28 of the review period, 2 days before the mandatory response window closed, the Constitutional Oversight Committee issued its first formal finding. It was preliminary and narrow in scope. The committee found that sufficient documented evidence existed to proceed to full constitutional review of the translation records and their effect on a defined set of IGC proceedings. This was not a ruling of wrongdoing. It was a determination that the question warranted examination. In legal terms, it was a threshold finding. In political terms, it was an earthquake. Because the proceedings flagged for review included 6 territorial decisions, 4 major resource allocation agreements, and 2 patrol jurisdiction assignments. Every one of those decisions was currently in active effect. Every one of them would now exist under a cloud of potential invalidation until the review was complete. The parties whose territorial holdings and agreements depended on those decisions had 24 hours to register formal status as interested parties in the review, which would give them standing to present evidence, but would also formally acknowledge that their positions were subject to review. 17 species registered within the first 12 hours. 3 more registered in the final hours before deadline. 20 species formally registered in a constitutional review process that the dominant bloc had not believed would reach this point. The IGC's administrative staff, processing the registration volume, sent a query to the Constitutional Committee asking whether additional session capacity would be required. The committee replied that capacity requirements would be assessed as the review proceeded and that all registered parties would receive scheduling information in due course. It was bureaucratic language. But bureaucratic language, processing 20 species and a review of the IGC's foundational decision-making integrity, carried a different weight than it had 3 weeks before. Asante's Phase 2 tracking document was updated that evening. Constitutional review full proceeding confirmed. 20 registered parties. Dominant block procedural options. Recused. Timeline, minimum 90 days. Phase 2 objectives, met. Below that, in a notation that was unusual for a document otherwise written in the dry language of strategic planning. E. Vasquez, briefed. No comment. As expected, the IGC patrol fleet was not, despite subsequent characterizations, a military force in the traditional sense. It operated under a charter that designated it as a stability and enforcement instrument, responsible for maintaining freedom of transit in IGC-governed corridors, responding to piracy and territorial violations, and projecting the Council's authority in contested or peripheral regions. In practice, it functioned as a military force, because stability enforcement at interstellar scale required the capacity to apply force. Its assets were substantial, over 300 active vessels across a range of classifications, with the dominant contribution coming from the Drevithi hegemony and, to a lesser extent, the Kethare. The Verity Union maintained a specialized force that handled the patrol corridors nearest their territorial sphere. The three remaining dominant species contributed in proportion to their interests. The patrol fleet had not engaged in a significant combat operation in 94 years. This was presented, internally and publicly, as a mark of the IGC's success. The absence of conflict indicated that the structure was working. The fleet existed as a deterrent, and the deterrent was functioning. What Gravetha's classified report had noted, and what humanity's own analytical teams had been assessing for years, was that 94 years of non-engagement had produced something that was less a deterrent and more a symbol. The fleet's vessels were maintained, updated on schedule, crewed according to regulation. But the organizational knowledge that comes from actual operational stress, the judgment, the adaptation, the understanding of where doctrine fails and improvisation succeeds, had not been tested in nearly a century. The Terran Confederacy's military had been tested continuously. Not in interstellar war, humanity had not fought an interstellar war. But in the 18 contested extraction rights disputes that had occurred in the outer systems over the past 60 years, humanity had deployed assets to protect its interests. In 6 of those disputes, the deployments had involved live threat environments. In 2, there had been direct engagement with non-state armed actors operating in contested space. The Confederacy's naval doctrine had been revised 6 times in the past 40 years, incorporating lessons from each operational experience. Its logistics network had been stress-tested. Its command structures had been evaluated against actual conditions and reformed accordingly. None of this was aggressive. None of it was expansionist. But it was operational, and operational readiness was a different quality than deterrent presence. On day 31, one day after the mandatory response window closed, the IGC's Patrol Fleet Command received a formal notification from the Terran Confederacy's Military Liaison Office. The notification was routine in format and extraordinary in content. It advised that the Terran Confederacy, in its capacity as a non-participant entity, was conducting a series of logistical capability demonstrations in the outer systems as part of its infrastructure partnership with the Helari, Mundri, and Cath. The demonstrations were not military exercises. They were described as operational readiness evaluations for support and escort functions that would verify the Confederacy's ability to fulfill its partnership commitments, specifically the commitment to ensure secure transit for Mundri relay network maintenance and Helari commercial traffic in the contested corridor regions. The notification included, as required under non-participant protocols, the coordinates and planned timing of the demonstrations. The planned coordinates covered 11 locations. 7 of them were in the outer system regions identified in humanity's classified strategic assessments as the thin points in the IGC patrol fleet's coverage, the gaps where the fleet's presence was theoretical rather than actual. The notification was technically correct. It was properly filed. It was exactly what a responsible non-participant entity should submit when conducting operations near IGC-governed space. And every officer in the Patrol Fleet Command who reviewed the coordinates understood, without any explanation being necessary, that the Terran Confederacy was demonstrating that it knew where those gaps were. The vessels deployed for the demonstrations were not the Confederacy's most formidable assets. They were, however, chosen carefully. What the Patrol Fleet Command observed, through standard monitoring of the activity that the Terran notification had made no attempt to conceal, were ships that moved with evident operational confidence, executed their positioning with precision, and maintained communication and coordination discipline that reflected genuine training rather than performance. There was no posturing. There were no aggressive gestures. The vessels maintained prescribed separation from IGC-governed corridors, operated in compliance with every applicable protocol, and completed their exercises on the stated schedule. Admiral Drevithi Fleet Commander Harithval, reviewing the monitoring data, dictated a brief internal assessment for his command staff. His species communicated primarily through subvocal harmonics that the translation array rendered in a tone that often sounded more clipped than was strictly accurate, but his meaning was precise. These are not demonstration vessels. These are operational vessels conducting what happens to be a demonstration. The distinction matters. His staff understood what he meant. A demonstration vessel is selected for appearance and presence. An operational vessel in a demonstration is selected because it can, if necessary, do more than demonstrate. The second part of the demonstration was more specific. 3 Terran vessels conducted escort operations for a Mundry relay maintenance convoy, a convoy that had previously operated without escort because the maintenance routes ran through a region where the patrol fleet presence was minimal. The convoy moved through its route on schedule. The Terran escorts communicated with the Mundry maintenance crew in a way that was evident to the monitoring systems. Pre-established protocols, clean frequency discipline, the practiced ease of entities who had worked together before. They had, in fact, worked together before. The Terran-Mundry partnership had been building practical operational familiarity for 4 months prior to its formal announcement. The convoy completed its route. The Terran vessels withdrew to non-participant space. No IGC assets had been approached, challenged, or engaged. But the patrol coverage gaps that the IGC had maintained as a theoretical absence, never formally acknowledged, never seriously addressed, had now been physically occupied briefly by another entity's assets. The theory had become a fact on the record. Harith Val sent a formal assessment to the IGC Council with a classified annex. The formal assessment was measured. No violations had occurred, the Terran operations were within non-participant protocols, monitoring would continue. The classified annex was considerably more direct. He had served in the patrol fleet for 31 years. He had never written anything quite like what followed. The Terran Confederacy has demonstrated 3 capabilities that this command assesses as operationally relevant. First, knowledge of our coverage gaps in detail sufficient to plan operations within them. This knowledge has either been compiled through observation over an extended period or obtained through sources we have not identified. Either conclusion has implications. Second, operational readiness that exceeds what could be expected from a 2-century spaceflight species based on trajectory modeling alone. Their logistics, communication discipline, and vessel handling reflect a naval institutional tradition that is more mature than their spaceflight history would account for. This requires assessment. Third, a clear willingness to operate in contested or under-patrolled space in support of allied entities. This is not aggression. It is capability signaling, conducted in a manner that is precisely calibrated to be unmistakable without being actionable. Recommendation: the Council should not interpret the absence of hostile intent as the absence of capability. The Terran Confederacy is not threatening the IGC. It is informing the IGC, through action rather than words, that it has options. The appropriate response is to take that information seriously. The classified annex was read by 11 people. 7 of them agreed with its conclusions. 2 believed it was overcautious. 2 had no formal response but requested, through separate channels, a private briefing from Terran diplomatic contacts. Those 2 requests, made quietly through back channels by representatives of dominant block species who had read a classified assessment and concluded that a quiet conversation was preferable to continued confrontation, were, to the people who received them, the most significant development since Article 7 had been invoked. Because those requests were not coming from peripheral species with grievances. They were coming from within the bloc that had voted to dismiss humanity 39-2. The architecture was beginning to shift. The 63rd day of the Constitutional Review was the day the IGC's dominant bloc formally requested direct bilateral talks with the Terran Confederacy. The request was processed through the non-participant liaison channel, the appropriate protocol for a council body communicating with an entity that had been reclassified outside the membership structure. It was a small detail, but it was not lost on anyone involved that the most powerful governance body in the known galaxy was initiating contact through a procedural channel designed for entities the Council had determined were not important enough for full membership. They had designed that channel. They had created the non-participant category. They had voted to put humanity in it. Now they were using it to ask for a meeting. Ambassador Vasquez received the request on a Tuesday morning, shipboard time, from her current position aboard the TCS Meridian in the Outer Systems, where she had been conducting the quiet bilateral engagements that had occupied most of the past 2 months. She read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Asante with a single-line note. Phase 3 conditions met. His reply was equally brief. Confirmed. Standard window or accelerated? She thought for a moment. The request from the dominant bloc was framed, in the careful language of diplomatic correspondence, as exploratory and non-binding, two words that typically indicated the requesting party was not yet ready to make commitments but needed to understand what the commitments might look like before they could decide. This was a predictable position for an institution that had operated as the unchallenged center of galactic governance for 2 millennia. She replied, "Standard. Let them wait the full window." The standard response window for non-participant bilateral requests was 15 days. Humanity would use all of them. The Constitutional Review had, by day 63, produced findings that the committee's chair, the Cath Representative Savath, who had aged visibly since the process began but had not once displayed anything other than meticulous procedural correctness, described in his weekly summary as extensive and consequential. The Solon Consensus's translation records had yielded, under independent technical analysis by a panel that included no Terran representatives but used the methodology developed by Terran consultants, 847 individually documented instances of material variance over the 40-year period. Of these, 312 had been classified by the panel as significant, meaning the variance was sufficient to have plausibly altered the outcome of the relevant proceedings. Of the 312 significant variances, 289 occurred in sessions where Solon territorial or economic interests were directly implicated. The statistical probability of that distribution occurring by chance was, according to the panel's mathematicians, indistinguishable from zero. The Solon Consensus had not formally conceded manipulation. Their legal team, aware that formal concession would trigger a separate set of consequences under the IGC's integrity statutes, had instead argued systematic methodological drift, a gradual unintentional divergence from neutral translation standards. The distinction between intentional manipulation and systematic unintentional bias was legally meaningful. It was also, in the estimation of everyone observing the process who was not directly employed by the Solon legal team, not a distinction that the evidence supported. The review of affected decisions had produced a document describing 31 IGC rulings that the committee found to have been materially influenced by the documented variances. These rulings were now under a provisional status designation, not invalidated, because invalidation would create immediate practical chaos for species whose current territorial and commercial situations depended on them, but flagged for remediation through a process to be determined. The Helari Republic's 3 contested corridor systems were in that group. So were resource allocation agreements affecting the Mundry Compact and the Cath Assembly. And so, discovered in the review of adjacent decisions, were 2 patrol jurisdiction assignments that the Drevithi hegemony had received without, the committee found, full and accurate information being available to the other deciding parties. This last finding was the one that the Drevithi had not anticipated. They had supported the broader proceedings with careful neutrality, they were not implicated in the translation manipulation, their record was clean on that specific question. But the patrol jurisdiction assignments were their gains, and they were now in the same provisional status as the Hilari's corridor systems. The Drevithi representative to the IGC Council had, according to the aide who was present, spent approximately 30 seconds reading the provisional status notification before asking to speak with the Council's senior counsel. The Terran Confederacy's formal response to the bilateral talks request was transmitted on day 15. It confirmed availability for talks and proposed an agenda that was, by design, straightforward and constructive. No preconditions. No ultimatums. A simple framework. The Confederacy was willing to discuss any aspect of the current situation and its implications in good faith, and had specific proposals to offer regarding the path forward for several of the issues under review. The specific proposals had been drafted over 6 weeks by a team of 37 people including lawyers, economists, strategic analysts, and 3 specialists in IGC constitutional history who had spent the review period identifying every relevant precedent and principle that might apply to the remediation process. The proposals were, in their architecture, generous, not because humanity was feeling magnanimous, though the tone was carefully calibrated, but because the most durable outcome of this entire process was one in which the IGC structural deficiencies were addressed in ways that created a more stable foundation going forward. An IGC that had been humiliated and forced into a position would be an IGC that spent the next century looking for ways to reverse what had been done to it. An IGC that had been guided, through a process it had not controlled but had ultimately participated in, toward genuine structural reform was a different kind of institution. This was not altruism. It was strategic. Humanity lived in the galaxy. It would live in the galaxy for the foreseeable future. The quality of the governance structure it shared with 43 other species mattered. The proposals included a reform of translation protocols, establishing independent verification standards for all contested proceedings going forward. A remediation framework for the 31 flag decisions, with a structured process for affected species to present evidence and receive adjusted outcomes where warranted. A revision of the patrol fleet's coverage mandate, establishing minimum presence requirements for outer system regions that had previously been left to practical interpretation. And the item that the dominant species had clearly been waiting for and that the Terran team had intentionally listed last, a proposal for a new membership category, full associate status, that would apply to spacefaring species not yet meeting the current full membership threshold, carrying genuine procedural rights rather than the observatory role that non-participant status provided. Humanity, under this proposal, would be the first full associate. The bilateral talks took place aboard a neutral station, a facility in the outer system that the Verity Union operated as a commercial hub, selected partly for its geographic neutrality and partly because its infrastructure was partially dependent on the Mundry relay network, a fact that everyone present was aware of and no one mentioned. Vasquez led the Terran delegation. Across from her sat representatives of 4 of the 5 dominant species. The Solon Consensus had sent a legal observer rather than a senior representative, a decision that spoke to the complexity of their current position. The Helari, Mundry, and Cath had sent observers. The smaller species who had requested private briefings from Terran contacts in the weeks after the demonstrations attended as well, their presence officially listed as interested parties. The talks lasted 11 days. What emerged was not a treaty, it was a framework document, a statement of principles and process commitments that each party would take back to their own institutions for ratification. It was the beginning of a process, not its conclusion. But what it contained was significant. The translation reform was agreed immediately. This was the easiest element because no one could defend the alternative. The remediation framework took 4 days to outline and would require years to implement, but the principle was accepted. The patrol coverage revision was contentious for 2 days and resolved through a formulation that required the dominant species to acknowledge the existing gaps without framing the acknowledgement as an admission of strategic intent, a distinction that mattered to them and was, in the circumstances, reasonably offered. The full associate status proposal was the last item discussed, as expected. It took 3 days. The final form was slightly different from the Terran proposal. The procedural rights were somewhat more limited in the initial phase, with expansion provisions tied to time and participation record. This was a concession that Vasquez had been authorized to make. On the evening of the 11th day, the framework document was initialed by all parties present. It was not a victory celebration. It was too professional for that, and the parties present were too aware of the complexity of what had occurred and what remained ahead for anything as simple as celebration. The Kethare representative, senior, experienced, a politician who had voted for the dismissal resolution and who had, in the 11 weeks since, clearly done considerable thinking about that decision, paused before leaving and addressed Vasquez directly. "You had planned this before we voted," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "We had prepared for it as a possible outcome," she said. "If the vote had gone differently, then the preparation would have been useful in other ways." She met his gaze steadily. "We weren't trying to create a crisis. We were trying to ensure that whatever happened, we had options." He was quiet for a moment. His species pattern recognition capability was working, she knew. Reading her biochemistry, looking for the tell that indicated she was underplaying, constructing a more aggressive outcome than she was describing. He found, apparently, nothing to contradict her. "You are a difficult species to dismiss," he said finally. "We've had practice," she said. "We used to do it to each other." The framework document was ratified by the Terran Council of Ministers 18 days later. The IGC's member species ratified in sequence over the following 3 months, with the Solon Consensus ratifying last, their internal deliberation clearly the most complicated of the group. The constitutional review concluded after 112 days with a final report that filled 600 pages and whose executive summary was distributed to every IGC member species as a public document. The first time in IGC history that a constitutional review of this scope had been publicly released rather than archived. The Hilari's corridor systems entered remediation proceedings. The process would take years. But it was moving. The Mundry Terran relay network continued its expansion. The new relay nodes that had come online during the review period remained in service. The Mundry's commercial position in the outer systems had measurably improved. The Cath Assembly's representative, Suveth, retired from his role on the Constitutional Oversight Committee 60 days after the review concluded and gave one public address in his own language, translated carefully and independently verified, in which he described the process as the most consequential and most exhausting work of my career, and noted, with the spare precision that characterized Cath communication, that the founding charter's authors had understood something important. Institutions require mechanisms for accountability to be genuine rather than theoretical. They had built those mechanisms in. It had simply taken 2,247 years for someone to use them. He did not mention the Terran Confederacy by name. He did not need to. On the day the IGC formally registered humanity's full associate status, a ceremony that was deliberately low-key, conducted in the same chamber where the dismissal vote had taken place, attended by considerably more species than had voted that day, Elena Vasquez stood at the speaking platform again. The translation array did not click off. She spoke for 8 minutes. Her remarks were measured, forward-looking, and contained no reference to what had preceded this moment beyond a single sentence at the end, that the Confederacy was grateful for the processes that had made this outcome possible and committed to contributing to the integrity of those processes in the years ahead. She did not gloat. There was nothing in her tone or words that could be characterized as triumphalist. This was partly professionalism. It was partly strategic. Gloating makes enemies, and humanity was going to live with these species for a very long time. And it was partly something else, something that was harder to articulate but that Tariq, standing to her left, had been thinking about for weeks. They had not won because they were stronger. They had not won because they had a fleet that could match the IGC's. They had not won because they had threatened anyone or forced any outcome through coercion. They had won because they had done their homework. Because they had read the charter and the precedents and the patrol schedules and the treaty obligations and the economic dependencies more carefully than the people who had written them. Because they had built relationships before they needed them. Because they had documented the truth before they needed to deploy it. Because they had understood, in a way that came from 10,000 years of being impossible for each other to ignore, that power is not just what you can compel, it is what you can demonstrate, what you can enable for others, and what you can make irreversibly true before anyone realizes it's happening. It was not a lesson the galaxy had fully learned yet, but it was beginning to.